Everything he's done so far to put pressure on Russia has been at arm's length and with plausible deniability. And any big words, they were basically said in the vast majority of cases by people other than Trump. Now, is that his way of trying to kind of keep that relationship great with Putin before that conversation or before the negotiations? Maybe. Is it something else? Could be as well.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford, and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today, I'm joined by Igor Novikov, former senior advisor to Zelensky, who oversaw US-Ukraine relations during the previous Donald Trump presidency. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Putin and Trump, they're set to talk today to discuss a ceasefire plan about Ukraine. Trump said that there are many elements of a final agreement that have been agreed to, but much still remains. And the White House has said that we've never been closer to a peace deal. Do you think they're right? But also, what do they mean by these many elements that have already been agreed to?
We could be close to a ceasefire. I think we're quite far away from a peace deal because there are so many unknowns and, really conflicting and scandalous kind of decisions to be made before that peace deal can be reached. There's a question of security guarantees. So I don't think we're close to a peace deal just yet. And I'm not even discussing Russia as an element here, although they are the key factor for any potential peace deal. The ceasefire, I think we're closer to, but it remains to be seen what Putin is willing to give Trump, because what Putin says and what he does, those are two completely different things. And basically, we're going to see during this call, and more importantly, in the weeks following this call, what Russia is willing to do rather than say.
And that's that interesting point that we heard from Trump recently when he said that they would be discussing this dividing up of assets that includes land, power plants. What did you make of that?
I'm pretty sure he's thinking about this. I'm sure he's discussing it with Russia. I know there have been attempts and discussions with Ukraine. There are many things that remain uncertain if this war were to end. First question, obviously, is what happens to the territories, starting with Crimea. But tragically, I think, the United States and some of its allies have already given up on Crimea and are even coming close to willing to recognize it internationally, which I think is a really bad thing, a really bad precedent, because we're pretty much agreeing to a pre-World War II world if we go back to that. There's also a question, for example, of the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. It's controlled by Russia. Russia doesn't have much use for it. It's a major hazard to international security because it's a nuclear power plant, and therefore any dispute over it is likely at some point to spill over and become a major catastrophe. So there's that. And there are many other things like prisoner swaps, security guarantees for Ukraine, kind of upholding any potential ceasefire, because, we've had 20 ceasefires since, Crimea in 2014, and every single one has been broken by Russia, not Ukraine. So there's a lot to try and pin down before any potential peace deal will even come into sight. But what's important here also to remember that, look, it's up to Russia. If Russia were to stop firing today, peace would arrive immediately. Why? Because it would be suicidal for Ukraine to even contemplating breaking that peace or ceasefire with Trump in the White House. So therefore, the reason the guns are still firing is Russia and Russia alone.
It's interesting because the White House, they said that division of land and assets had already been discussed with Kyiv. Do you think that is the case? And if so, what would you say has been discussed on that part?
I would say, in some shape or form, everything has already been discussed. But discussing something and agreeing upon something are two completely different things. So as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, as of now, there's no agreement. There are only discussions, positive discussions with Ukraine, but we have one key uncertain element, and that's Russia. So that's kind of the key focus here.
Because you could say that's sort of a sticking point there in terms of any potential peace deal negotiations going on. We've got Putin on the one hand demanding that Ukraine surrenders 4 of its regions as well as Crimea, but then you've also got Zelensky who's saying that Ukraine will refuse to formally cede territories to Russia. Do you think there's any reassurance there from Trump, from the White House, that they will try and push for Ukraine's stance there for territorial integrity?
No, they wouldn't push for that. And I mean, we can say whatever we like, but Trump is very cynical and pragmatic when it comes to brokering this peace deal, and everyone understands that Russia will make a claim to that territory, and at the moment there's no unity in between Ukraine and its Western allies to even equip Ukraine to try to get those territories back, to fight back for them. So I think Trump is being a realist here and a cynic and a pragmatist. So he's going to say, like, look, Russia can have what it has, at least for now. Now, the key factor here will be whether it's going to be internationally recognized. One thing I can tell you for sure, Ukraine will not recognize any loss of territory formally. So, I mean, there could be a ceasefire, there could even be a peace deal, but it doesn't mean recognition. And that's very important to understand. And given the fact that Russia actually wants this war to continue, that at some point will be used as an excuse to say that Ukraine doesn't want peace.
That other point there is about Ukrainian membership to NATO. That's something that Russia says that they want to veto. And again, Ukraine has said, no, you can't veto that, but also a limit on the size of Ukrainian military as well. Do you think that's a realistic expectation?
I would say a limit on the size of Ukraine's military is unrealistic. We have been attacked twice before, so no sane Ukrainian president or government official will ever agree to basically just kind of handcuffing our hands behind the back and waiting for another strike, which will turn out to be lethal for the country and for its sovereignty. So that's, I think, is out of question, although some small concessions might be made and so on and so forth. But de facto, we know that it's not going to happen. As far as the NATO membership is concerned, I mean, I'm a NATO skeptic. It's in our legislation that Ukraine should join NATO and the European Union. But at the same time, given the shape of NATO now, given the fact that Ukraine is not wanted there, and there's not Ukraine not unwilling to join, it's actually our major allies blocking Ukraine from joining for whatever reason. I know the reasons, but it's up to them to kind of mention them again. I think NATO will be discussed, and I think a certain agreement will be reached on that particular point.
I guess the big question here is, do you think that Trump does have that ability to push Putin in both the directions that he wants to go in terms of a ceasefire deal and in a potential peace deal down the line? President Macron of France, he's insisted that Trump was committed to the conditions that Russia must meet for a 30-day ceasefire to begin. Do you think that Macron's thinking on the right lines here?
I think he's thinking on the right lines, but it remains to be seen what President Trump's motivation is. I mean, I see two potential scenarios here. One, Trump is going to try and push Russia. Russia will push back, and Trump will refocus his attention on Ukraine. We'll start blaming Ukraine, or even worse, he will turn his attention elsewhere, like Iran or North Korea or something like that. And Russia will be trying to achieve that particular end goal. If that doesn't work out, does President Trump have capacity and that kind of healthy insanity to push Putin towards the potential peace deal? He does. He can be unpredictable, and we all know that Putin only listens to strength. Now, whether Trump is prepared to actually exercise that strength to push Russia into a corner, that remains to be seen. And I'm not entirely optimistic there. And look, it's not only about Ukraine. There are many other kind of important things playing out at the moment. One thing that we discussed before we went live with this interview is the future of the Russian opposition and Russian dissidents, because we have hundreds of thousands, I think millions of Russians who disagree with Putin, who want to see Russia as a democratic country and part of the sane part of the global society. They are dissidents, they're fugitives, and Putin is actively hunting them down, killing them, opening criminal cases against them. My best friend, like literally my best friend, is a Russian dissident, guy called Noise MC. Well, what happens to them? during or after those negotiations. Because if Trump is willing to cede Ukrainian territory, he's likely to be willing to cede those people to Putin, or just leave them be wherever they are in the world. Now, if that were to happen, I think that's as dangerous as recognizing annexed Ukrainian territory. Why? Because you're pretty much condemning, Russia to a future, to an authoritarian future here, without any alternative for many generations to come. If that happens, it's going to be horrible. It's going to be a nightmare for the national security of the United States. It's going to be horrible for the national security of European states and the United Kingdom. And I think that would be the mistake that will be regretted the most, as an outcome of the processes that we're seeing here. So I think that needs to be discussed. And what scares me is the fact that people don't even mention it.
Do you think we have any indications there that on what Trump may do on that part?
I think he'll do nothing. He'll do nothing. I mean, if what happened to Voice of America or Radio Free Liberty is anything to go by here, I think he doesn't care. And as far as like the Russian dissidents are concerned, I don't think he's even aware of them, in a sense. Like he's definitely not thinking about them. And I think if Putin, what's even worse here, I mean, if I were to guess, I'd say that given the scale of other things on the table, if Putin mentions this to Trump and asks him to kind of deport people from the U.S. or kind of betray them, I think that's something Trump will be willing to look into, and that's a major threat.
I mean, in terms of a pushback there from Trump onto Putin, if we looked at last week when we saw that Putin rejecting that ceasefire negotiation proposal by America with a list of his own conditions instead, we then heard from Trump's White House press secretary, and she said that Trump was willing to impose sanctions on Russia if necessary. I mean, do you think that Trump would push for sanctions on Russia if that conversation between the leaders doesn't go the way that Trump wants it to go?
Well, that's something we can hope for, as Ukrainians and as Europeans. Does he have capacity to do so? Yes. Will he do that? That depends on his motivation. And I think, given everything that he's doing now, that remains to be confirmed. Let's put it this way, in that TBC status here. I think, I think what's likely to happen here is that Putin will try and play delay tactics. And if Trump accepts them, that means that his motivation is to actually end this conflict without applying any real pressure on Russia. Have we seen any steps towards sanctions or any other pressure on Russia? Yes, we have. He basically did not extend the exemption from the sanctions for Russian banks to do with the energy sector. He's done a couple of other things, but everything he's done so far to put pressure on Russia has been at arm's length and with plausible deniability. And any big words, they were basically said in the vast majority of cases by people other than Trump. Now, is that his way of trying to kind of keep that relationship great with Putin before that conversation or before the negotiations? Maybe. Is it something else? Could be as well.
I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. We had Donald Trump's former national security advisor, McMaster, on Times Radio yesterday, and he said that Putin's profoundly weak at this stage. He said that Putin's sitting on piles of cash that he can't convert. He's spending about 47% of the equivalent of GDP on defense. So when it comes to negotiations, Putin is going to try and get as much as he can. But on the other hand, McMaster said that there is no serious intent there from Putin for peace. I mean, what do you make of that?
I think the state of the Russian economy is bad at the moment. I think many people don't realize that. It's much worse than people think. Now, is that something that will kind of force Putin to make concessions? No. And to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, we keep forgetting, I don't know why, we keep omitting another key player in this whole geopolitical process, and that is China. Now, what does China think about this? Will China let Russian economy collapse? Will China let Putin make concessions here? Will China kind of try and kind of give him some support to put him in a stronger position against Trump? We don't know. But China needs to be looked at here. And every time we discuss Trump and Putin, we must not forget that Chairman Xi is also part of that equation. And there are many potential scenarios of what can transpire and happen. And I think the most shocking one will be if Trump ever kind of plays that isolationist card to the fullest extent. We're going to see China trying to assume America's role in global politics, and all of that is going to happen within the next 3 to 6 months. So we'll definitely see. It won't be boring. That's one thing I can guarantee.
Finally, Trump said that we will see if we can get something announced maybe by Tuesday following this conversation between him and Putin. What do you think we might hear? And do you think we will hear anything?
I would seriously hope so. But with Russia, even with President Trump, despite his unconventional way of doing things, I allow myself to be optimistic from time to time. As far as Putin is concerned, I'm never an optimist. I'm looking at his motivation here. He's not interested in a ceasefire. He's not interested in ending this war. That's a key kind of factor for his political survival in the long term in Russia. The war is his excuse to tighten all the bolts and to repress people. Therefore, he's not interested in ending this war. Will he succumb to Trump's pressure and just agree to a ceasefire? Maybe. Will he try and break that ceasefire if that were the case? Most definitely. Will he try to blame that on Ukraine? Yes. And another factor that I will mention, just in case, because of these negotiations, we're going to see a lot of different troop movement and basically borders being redrawn and so on and so forth. Now, we know what happens when Russia leaves the occupied territory. I mean, we've seen Bucha, we've seen Irpin, we've seen the massacres and everything. Will Russia try and play the same card in Kursk region? Therefore, when Ukraine withdraws and moves back, will it try and say, look, Ukraine's been doing the same thing? Most likely. Russia is, amazing when it comes in, quote unquote, in doing false flag operations. Therefore, I think we're going to see a number of dramatic developments over the next couple of weeks. And even if there is a ceasefire, Putin will do everything in his power to break and then blame it on Ukraine.
Igor Novikov, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you for inviting me.